Salutation, my esteemed students of siege warfare. I am Professor Siege Captain, and today's lecture is a monolithic one. Make sure you have your quills sharpened and your ink ready, as you're gonna need to take notes, because today we are covering the siege tower.
Yes, hi, excuse me, Professor. Are we really gonna have an entire lecture about a box on wheels?
My dear student, you have zero understanding of the siege tower. Make sure you stay for my whole lecture, and I'm not kidding about those notes. There's gonna be a quiz at the end of this episode. I need to make sure you have a proper understanding of siege towers, so don't miss a second of my lecture to ensure that your siege towers don't become just an expensive pile of kindling at your next siege. Also, get in the comments below and comment what you would name your siege tower if you had the privilege of building one. I know what I would name mine. That name, of course, being the Captain of Siege. That's a good name. That's a good name. The siege tower's origin story is cloudier than a battlefield. We have some depictions from the ancient world showing some depictions of these towers that are made out of like ladders that could arguably be called siege towers. And there are like loose mentionings of them here and there, but our first definitive siege tower comes to us from who other than the ancient Assyrians. These guys invented everything siege. I love the ancient Assyrians. Entering the siege meta around the 9th century BC, these mad lads, the Assyrians, looked at castle walls and said, what if we build our own castle walls on the offense and we're gonna put them on wheels? In this relief depicted at the Northwest Temple in Nimrud, we can see carved in the 9th century BC, the siege tower. When it comes to sieges, the defense almost always has the advantage. This is because the walls. Walls are a great defensive structure. One of the biggest advantages the walls give is the static high ground. You're above your enemies, it is really easy to shoot arrows and drop rocks. The Assyrians looked at the defense having the high ground and said, what if the turntables? And they made their own high ground and used it to great effect on the offense of siege. These early siege towers were little more than glorified archer platforms. The depictions don't really show if they had like a boarding bridge or weapons inside of them, but we can infer from these reliefs that they were laden with archers. Also, the Assyrians had the cool battle wagon with the ram in it, and that kind of has a siege tower up top, but again, that's probably just an archer platform. Imagine rolling to the function in one of those things. You'd be the talk of the town, though people might be making fun of you. After the Assyrians did all the legwork proving that the siege tower was worth its salt, the Mediterranean world caught siege tower fever like a plague outbreak. Many more depictions of them show up, but the next moment in history I want to talk about is the Athenian siege of Syracuse in 413 BC. Not to be confused with all these other sieges of Syracuse. That city has been sieged a lot. This moment is so notable because the Athenians decided to put siege towers on a boat. Nobody let OSHA know about this because this is so cool. I need to see this done. They decided that sieges weren't exciting enough and now we need to add drowning to our siege potential. And this makes sense. Syracuse was a city on the coast. The coast is a great defensive advantage. What if we could negate this a little bit by putting our siege towers on the water? Alexander the Great would also take inspiration from this idea. He would build massive siege towers on boats. This just proves how ancient siege engineering was a hold my beer, watch this, that modern safety regulations just doesn't allow for anymore. Alexander the Great would also famously turn Tyre, the island city, into not an island anymore. In 332 BC, he built a causeway all the way out into the sea to get to Tyre. And on this causeway, he built the 2 largest siege towers to ever exist at that point in history. I love the spirit of Alexander the Great, and his inspiration led the Macedonians to build the pinnacle of siege towers. These giant towers had the name of Heliopolis, which means city taker in Greek. That's like the modern equivalency of naming your siege tower the Doomslayer. At a staggering height of up to 40 meters, these towers had a base that was 20 meters by 20 meters as well. These are not siege towers anymore. These are land battleships. Crews on the inside could number up to 3,400 people. Couple that with customizable loadouts, you could build these towers to have siege weapons built inside. Now you're rolling up to the walls with ballista, catapults, battering rams mounted into the tower, plus lots of room for archers. That is one angry tower. But speaking of battleships, this reminds me of one of the oldest mentions of siege towers in naval warfare. That's from 500 BC. I'm sorry for the pronunciation of names. They're gonna even be worse than my Greek. And this is just a snippet of the quote. It's a little bit longer, but I just cut it down for expediency. Wu Zikshu wrote, King Helu, great wing ships correspond to heavy chariots. Castle ships to mobile assault towers. Siege towers are independently developed all around the world because they're just such a brilliant idea. It's also hilarious to me that a general trying to explain to a king uses comparison like that. It makes me think of the modern day trend to compare every video game to Dark Souls. Like, this game is the Dark Souls of whatever genre. This game's the Dark Souls of first-person shooters. Basically saying siege towers are the equivalency of Dark Souls bosses on the siege battlefield. So we've already talked about Alexander the Great. Who is a man that can compare to him? Well, arguably Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar addressed one of the problems of siege towers being on boats. This problem, of course, being that the taller your ship is, the higher the center of gravity goes. The higher the center of gravity, the higher chance of your ship capsizing. Your ship capsizing is unwanted in naval battles. My man Julius had his engineers invent siege towers that could lay down onto the deck of the ship. This is still in BC times. They're inventing battleships that have siege towers on them that can fold down. Ancient engineering is just astounding to me. I love this kind of stuff. The siege tower had a long history on the battlefield as well. We've been talking about in the BC times, coming to us around the 9th century BC, but they would continue to be used all the way through the Middle Ages. The example I would like to give is at the siege of Constantinople in 626 AD. Again, Constantinople, another city that just can't help itself being sieged all the time. But in this siege, we find the Avars sieging Constantinople with 12 siege towers. That is a huge number of towers. These towers were not easy to build. We will get into the logistics of building these towers later on in the video. They're not just something you could whip up real quick. Most sieges would only see a handful of siege towers at most, usually numbering 2, 3, 4 siege towers. So deploying 12 towers in one battle is unheard of. And to add insult onto injury, the siege was unsuccessful. That's probably because Constantinople was like the most defensible city. That's kind of why they built it there. At this siege, the Chronicon records that there was 12 lofty siege towers covered in hides. These weren't just poorly built wooden structures that failed the siege. These were nicely built and covered in hides. That just goes to show how much of an advantage defense has in a siege. It's up to the offense to come up with any idea to try to level the battlefield. Another reason why you'd only deploy a couple of siege towers in a siege is how nightmarish it was to try to move them. Trying to move a siege tower is like trying to relocate your house well under archer fire. So siege towers are so cool and impressive. What happened to them? Why did they stop getting used? Another common trope in siege warfare is that gunpowder kind of ruins everything. You've heard the saying, you can't hit the broadside of the barn. Well, siege towers are the broadside of the barn rolling closer to you. It's not even target practice at that point. It's literally shooting the offenders in a barrel. And the barrel's the siege tower, and it's a slow moving barrel. With all that said, this leads us to the weapon specifications of the siege tower. Building a siege tower begins with finding out the height of your enemy walls. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can get all your guys to stack up on their shoulders until you roughly reach the height of the walls, and then you can lay down those guys and measure it. Or you can do it in a much more nerdy way. You can put a post in the ground of a known height, and you can measure the length of the shadow of the post, and you can find the scale factor. So if you have your post and the shadow is 0.8 times the length, now if you measure the length of the shadow of the walls at the same time of the day, you can figure out roughly the height of your walls. This will give your siege engineers the information of how tall your siege towers need to be. Next, it was up to the generals to decide what kind of siege tower would be applicable for taking the city. As stated, siege towers were extremely customizable. You could have them be just mobile weapon platforms, or you can have them be more of a boarding bridge for your troops. You can have them as a combination. You can put a battering ram in the siege tower. So you would consult with your generals and commanders and officers and engineers and talk about, ooh, what kind of siege towers do we want? But you need to get working. They take a long time to build. That is a lot of lumber that needs to be shaped and joined using mortise and tenon joinery for you woodworking nerds out there. Not only that, you have to source your own wood. Menard's lumber yards aren't going to be invented for another 2,000 years. And building the frame and platforms was the easy part. The most common enemy to a siege tower would be fire. This meant you need to armor plate your siege towers. This is one of the moments in history when a weapon skin isn't just cosmetic, it actually serves a very important purpose. Fireproofing was the name of the game. The most common way this would be done would be by stuffing animal hides with some kind of fire-resistant material like wool, and then before you roll it up to the walls, you would soak your siege tower in buckets of water. There would be members of the crew whose whole job it was to just saturate the armor with water on the siege tower. If the besieger was wealthy enough, or they found mom's credit card, they could buy the metal armor DLC. Some siege towers were coated with lead or iron tiles. This is just an ancient tank at this point. That's straight up mogging on your enemy if you're like, yeah, we have enough extra iron that we can coat our siege towers in the stuff. The interior design of the siege weapon also had some customizable options. You could use ladders to save space at the cost of troops being able to go up and down faster. The most common one was just a giant grand staircase up the back of the siege tower where it would let off at different parts in the floor. Here's a picture of it, it's really cool. Or you could build 2 grand staircases on either side of the siege tower to let more troops go up and down faster. The more floors meant the more windows you could put in, the more weapons that the siege tower could use. You could affix those windows with armor-plated shutters themselves to prevent projectiles and keep it fireproof. These are marvels of engineering. A neat feature that would also save some weight would be that you could leave the entire back of the tower open because the defenders can't shoot that point. This would allow the commanders to see in the tower and kind of get a feel of what's going on in there. Siege towers inflicted a massive mental debuff on the defenders. You have to stand atop your walls as the armor-plated skyscraper slowly rolls across the battlefield. Even smaller towers would be intimidating, because you know you're about to have arrows being shot down at you while you're standing on top of your walls. However, these massive engineering marvels came with some drawbacks. The sheer weight of these suckers meant you needed to have massive wheels and axles to support them without having them crumble under their own weight. The famous city taker at Rhodes, designed by Polyidus of Thalasse, featured 8 15-foot diameter wheels with 4 large axles. The tower weighed 160 tons. Imagine trying to move that tower. A large amount of this weight was due to the fact it was armored with iron plates. This is the ultimate flex. If I see that tower coming up to my walls, I'm surrendering. I'm done. Speaking of moving these towers, the ancients came up with an ingenious idea on how to move them. Troops under the cover of mobile sheds would advance in front of the tower and drive stakes into the ground. On these stakes, there would be a pulley, most likely. Then ropes would be tied to the front of the siege tower, and the ropes would be driven out to the stakes around the pulleys and back underneath the siege tower. This meant people behind the siege tower, people or animals behind the siege tower, could grab a hold of the ropes and pull, driving the siege tower forward. You can get any number of people to help pull the siege tower now, as long as you have a long enough rope, and they're in the cover of the siege tower, protecting them from that pesky archer fire. No one wants to be turned into a pincushion while doing physical labor. In order to do this physical labor, thank God siege camps just so happen to have thousands of bored soldiers waiting around with nothing to do. That's right, I said thousands. Sometimes thousands of men would be used to move single siege towers. That coupled with oxen and horses to help drive the tower forward as well. In a really tragic twist of fate, that massive tower at Rhodes failed spectacularly. The defenders simply flooded the field and turned it into mud. This just goes to show that mud is the ultimate force in a military campaign. Well, the second greatest force, behind gold. The wheels of siege towers were affixed in a line, so they could either go forward or backward. If you wanted to turn your wheels, you had to pick up the corner of the tower, remove the wheels out, turn them 90 degrees, and then put them back. And now your tower can go sideways. But the city taker at Rhodes, people speculate had ancient casters, allowing it to have lateral movement. How did they come up with this stuff? It also used a rack and pinion movement system. I wish the city taker at Rhodes worked so we could have seen so many more of these throughout history. I, Professor Siege Captain, would love to be the engineer of a siege tower. I'd be in the siege camp, be like, ah yes, quite, make it 9 stories tall. Grab all the iron we can find, armor plate the sucker. What do you want inside of it? Numerous ballista? Yes, fit as many ballista as possible in this tower. And the engineers would be taking notes and they would actually build this thing. And after it's built, I'm gonna climb up to the top of the siege tower. I'm gonna stand over it looking down at the puny walls and I'm gonna say something that like an ancient guy would be like, "Our siege towers will blot out the sun." And then I would start manning one of the ballistas, shooting at the defenders while maniacally laughing. Being a siege tower engineer sounds like a grand time. As long as you're not one of the people that has to pull the siege tower or being sieged by it. All right, students, if you find yourself being sieged by a siege tower, we're gonna cover a couple of options you have to help defend against the tower. The first option is the natural enemy of any wooden structure. Wood has a little tendency to burn. That means you need to use fire to defeat these towers. Even if the outside is covered in hides and armor plates, you still have a chance of catching that wooden structure behind it on fire. You could also try to do raids at night to get out to the tower and get some men inside of it to try to set it on fire. Fire has always been the hard counter for wood structures. Another option you have that's a little less reliable is just focus firing all your siege weapons on the tower. They're going to be armor plated, they're going to be really robust structures. But it has happened. In England, a tower got one shot by a siege weapon. Imagine how demoralizing it would be to see weeks of construction one shot. You also should plan ahead. Siege towers need the red carpet rolled out for them. Crews would go out in front of the siege tower in armored sheds, not to just pound stakes in the ground, but they would also have to remove obstacles like rocks, logs. They'd have to fill in moats or ditches. If you're thinking ahead, put lots of rocks in your field, build some moats, build some ditches, build a pitfall like Jesse and James from Team Rocket. Another realistic defense strategy you have is to do a little rain dance. If you can get it to rain enough, that's gonna turn the field into mud and it's gonna stop the siege tower's advance. Hopefully it doesn't start raining when you're trying to set the siege tower on fire. It's a little counteractive. And this leads us to Professor Siege Captain's 100% historically accurate ranking of the siege tower. I'm putting the siege tower in A tier ranking. It probably gets as high in A tier as you can get without being S tier. They were an effective part of the meta for 4,000 years. You don't stay in the siege meta that long without being reliable. Also, they were pretty easy to design. They weren't the easiest things to build. They also weren't extremely complex unless you're trying to build a city taker like the Greeks. They don't get the S tier ranking because they really couldn't be used at any siege. There are plenty of examples of terrain being too rocky or ground being too soft to deploy a siege tower. They're not the ones destroying the walls. They need to be filled with rams and catapults and ballista, and oftentimes they're just dropping troops up onto the walls. I can't give anything siegey an S tier ranking unless it's effectively destroying the defenses. But anything having this long and storied of a history deserves some serious siege respect. Siege towers lived a good life, and while gunpowder made them mostly not used anymore, in 1552, Ivan Virodkov made a siege tower and loaded that siege tower up with cannons to be used as an offensive battery. This is just another step closer to it being a battleship. There's also an example of a siege tower being used in Japan in the 1800s, being used to crush a rebellion. And that's where we're gonna wrap it up. I, Professor Siege Captain, am an eternal student. I love learning about siege weapons. The comments on the last video were truly heartwarming. I read every single one of them. I responded to most unless they were weird. There were a couple weird ones back on that video, but I love reading every type of comment. The weird ones, the hate-filled ones. I obviously like the ones full of love and care a little bit more. I do these videos for the dialogue, the back and forth between you and me. Without you guys, I'm just here yelling about sieges in my room. Speaking of the dialogue, if you want to continue the dialogue in a slightly better place, it's only slightly better than the YouTube comment section, but it is slightly better. I started a subreddit. Don't just call it a Reddit. If you just call it a Reddit, your cameraman will yell at you and he'll be like, it's a subreddit. I started a subreddit. It's called Siege Weapons of History. It's going great. I every Monday post on it, the Siege Machine Monday, where we're kind of doing small snippets of these tier lists where we can discuss siege machines. That's really fun. Come on over and interact with that. And this leads us to today's quiz question. Even though I butchered his name out loud, it was on the screen. What is the name of the man who is credited for designing the Heliopolis, the city taker? First person to comment it right, without Googling it, I will know if you Googled it. Watch my video to know. First person to comment it right will get pinned and will get a nice little heart from Professor Siege Captain. The last time I did a heart, it didn't turn out very good. Is this better? What's this one? This one? Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for watching. We have a finite time on this earth. Time is the one resource we're not getting any more of. And you decided to spend some of that time with me. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's sally forth, build some of our own siege towers, and siege the day. Class dismissed, you monolithic tower enthusiasts. This is Liliana. She doesn't like when I record videos because I'm too loud. Ivan Virodkov? In 1552, Ivan Virodkov